right, so let's have a look at the second part of kind of like perception, misperceptions, misbeliefs about implicit measures. We talked before about that maybe we should caution or use caution when we say, hey, everyone has an implicit bias, but more importantly, we talked about that the implicit bias is an implicit bias, but not necessarily an unconscious bias. People seem to have awareness of their performance on these implicit measures, and they seem to be aware whether they're doing not so good or quite well, so they can predict their own behavior on these tests. So it doesn't seem that these implicit biases defined by their performance on these tests are unconscious. Now we want to talk a little bit about, I think three more, maybe four. Let's have a look. That might make it easier. Okay, so we talked about, does everyone have it? We talked about, is implicit bias unconscious? Now we probably talk about the most important one. Does implicit bias drive racist behavior, right? And I think in some ways, what we were hoping to find an answer to with these implicit bias, as you remember from the beginning of our lecture, right, was to say, hey, there's this puzzle that the explicit attitudes get more and more positive, but the behavior we see is still too often, or seem to be too often, guided by some type of prejudice. And so we try to develop these implicit measures as a way of assessing maybe the attitudes that actually drive the behavior, right? We want to explain why, for instance, in hiring situations and when it gets a little bit more ambiguous, too often people prefer the in-group over the out-group. Sorry. So now let's have a look at that and go back to one of the studies we already introduced earlier in our lecture. Sorry, I should backpedal. Let's have a look at what Gawronski writes about the state of the art, how implicit measures relate to behavior. And he writes, although some researchers suggested that statistically small relations between implicit bias and behavior could nevertheless have large societal effects, the obtained average correlations are certainly disappointing. And that kind of mirrors a little bit of what we talked about earlier when we talked about explicit attitudes. Yet sometimes a little bit disappointing how attitudes relate to behavior. Why are they not as strongly related as we in our social psychological theories hope they are? And so one of the key answers to that could be related to something we talked about the last time, right? That we talked about earlier as well today, and that is there a good correspondence, right? Is there a good correspondence between the attitude I measure and the behavior? So what is maybe a type of behavior that an implicit bias might be predicted? Maybe what is a type of behavior that an explicit bias would predict? So maybe it's not if implicit biases predict all types of racist behavior, but what kinds, okay? So let me explain by go back finally to the study that I just mentioned, the study we elaborated already early on. Remember, we have invited student participants. They come in, we measure their explicit attitudes on the left and their implicit attitudes on the right. Now we have that. We learned that they do not correlate very strongly with each other. In fact, they did not in that study correlate with at all with each other. And now what happens next? So our person then was brought into a room. In the room there were cameras, and he was sat at a table, and on the other side of the table was another black student, a Confederate, so somebody who was part of that study. But all she had to do in this had to talk with the participants about a topic. There you can see on the top of the slide, dating in the current era has some advantage and disadvantage to dating in earlier periods. Please consider and discuss what you personally feel are these advantages and disadvantages, right? This might, as you can easily see, kind of get on difficult topics of interracial relationships. It doesn't have to be, but the context surely suggests it. So they have this conversation, they're filmed while doing that. And this was done, the filming was done in order to then give raters, different people, the chance to rate the nonverbal behavior of the participants, okay? But after they're done, both of them, the Confederate and our student participants, were brought in a different room, and now they had to say, how do you think it went? Okay, what was your impression of whether the other person liked it and how you performed? So we have some kind of self-perception. Right. So now we have a host of different types of behaviors that we can now relate to explicit and implicit attitudes. So let me explain what I mean by that. And let me kind of push this over here, and then I could use maybe this. Never you did this. This can only go wrong. Okay, good. Okay, so what we see here is basically the explicit prejudice, and then I think this disappears pretty soon into implicit prejudice. Okay, let's start with the explicit prejudice and look at this correlation table. What we see is that this correlates with 3, which is verbal behavior. Verbal behavior is basically what did the participants say during the study. So this is something that's under your control, it's easily controllable. So people who thought, I'm not a racist, also did not say racist things during these taped conversations. And what else do we find? There's a stronger or a moderation with number 5, the self-perception. So a student who came in and said, like, when asked, I think I'm not on explicit attitudes, what control behavior, right? They were asked, how do you think about black students? And they said, like, very favorably. Then this kind of was reflected in what they said during the conversation and how they felt the conversation went. So they felt like, oh, I did really well. And so the self-perception and the verbal behavior was well predicted by these explicit attitudes, which might be kind of like grouped together by behavior that's easily controlled. A little bit different than from the implicit prejudice, right? Here you can see a strong correlation with number 4, which is nonverbal behavior, right? Just as we think about these implicit attitudes measured on these, I think here it was not the IIT as you remember, but this procedural evaluation task invented by Ross Fazio, sorry. Here what you can see that this predicted stronger behavior that was harder to control, nonverbal behavior, and it also predicted the most important thing, Confederate perceptions. Look at how strong this correlation is, really impressive. So what you see here is that basically there's these 2 clusters where we think implicit attitudes are better to predict maybe things like liking, like nonverbal behavior, anything that is less easily controllable, that's less easily maybe perceived as something that expresses prejudice and negative attitudes, whereas everything that's kind of like controllable, that is consciously perceived as expressing prejudice and negative attitudes, such as what you say or how you think you acted, correlates stronger with explicit attitudes. So instead of saying, oh, do kind of like implicit attitudes predict racism. No, they predict certain aspects of it, right? So things that are spontaneous, things that are less, right? Here's like, this is what you kind of like the summary, what we can see. Implicit measures outperform explicit measures in predicting spontaneous behavior, just as nonverbal indicators of your behavior. Behavior performed under conditions that impair cognitive deliberation. So if you're stressed, right, then basically you have less control over your behavior, and now your behavior is better predicted by implicit rather than explicit attitudes, and by people who are maybe less capable of controlling their behavior. Okay. People who, for instance, are more willing to go with their gut, who use a more intuitive thinking style rather than a very deliberate one. Okay, so it's not so much that, implicit attitudes help us to understand all types of racism. No, but they relate to really important aspects of racist behavior. And I think there's something where it's like in this current discussion, where I feel like in times the tide turned too far against the idea that the IIT can tell us something interesting. I think the IIT still has a really good predictive value for a certain set of behaviors, and I think we should not forget that. Okay. Now we come to another one, which was also like, is it stable over time? So the idea here would basically be that, why do we have these problems within society? Because somehow young children early on acquire, I think I have this on the next slide, they acquire a negative attitude towards an outgroup, and then it never changes, right? Here it's like Gawronski, right? A narrative according to which a person's score on an implicit measure reflects a trait-like characteristics of the person. These traits are acquired early in childhood and remain stable over the course of their development. So basically, my children would grow up, if they would grow up in a environment that fosters negative racist attitudes, then they would get this implicit association between white and good and black and bad that would be in them like a trait, and it would never change again, because you can't reach and change these because they're outside of your consciousness and control, which we saw already earlier is not the case. But that was the idea. So one of the early studies was by Marjan Banachi, who is another kind of like inventor of the IAT, a wonderful researcher, and she has here in the study, she reports the findings where they asked one cohort of participants. This is a cross-sectional study, okay? So they look at one time, they look at a group of participants who are 6 years old, who are 10 years old, who are adults. They're kind of like funny, picture-driven IITs for young children, so you don't rely on language. And you can see on the left, right, that for 6 years old, 10 years old, and adults, basically the effect size of the IIT, the D score that's derived from that, is the same, okay? So meaning, in other words, that the preference for white over black starts with 6 years, and that's how they input it, and it kind of stays the same over the time. But it's important to remember that these are different people. It's not that we ask one person with 6, and then with 10 again, and then with 20, or whenever you're an adult, and we correlated that, right? It's not a longitudinal study, it's a cross-sectional study. So if, for instance, the context would kind of indicate white over black bias, or the context would support such an kind of implicit bias, then we would expect to find the same results, right? So what we need is basically a longitudinal study. So let's look at such longitudinal studies and what they find. And if you look at longitudinal studies, then what you can see is basically, okay, we have here an average stability of 0.54, so for implicit measures. So this is like where they kind of looked at implicit measures over time. I think it was like from 6 months. It says like, okay, it's not even that long, right? 1 to 2 months, okay? So it's like 1 to 2 months. And so if I have your IIT score at 0.1, a month ago and today, it correlates by 0.54. So it correlates, but not very strongly. It's about 25%, as you know, of variance explained. If you, for instance, look at the explicit attitudes, right, then there's much more stability. So if you stretch it more over the time, then you can see that the cross-sectional, the longitudinal stability of implicit biases is not very high, okay? So the same person, it seems like within the same person, there's a lot of variety and variance when it comes to implicit biases. So the idea that they're stable over time is actually not true, and it might actually be the opposite. It might actually be that explicit measures or explicit attitudes are much more stable than implicit attitudes, okay? So how can that be? And I think there's like the last... Is it the last one? Yes, it is the last one. Is implicit bias not affected by context? So there's, and I explain that in a second why is that interesting, but that will help us to understand, okay? How is it possible that we basically everyone shows it, but if I correlate myself with myself over an extended period of time, then the correlations between my measurements in the IIT are relatively low. How can that be? And context seems to be a real important factor to answer this question. So Let's talk a little bit about automaticity. I think you recall this from one of your many cognitive psychology modules, right? Automaticity is basically that a kind of a bottom-up process, right? Upon seeing a stimulus, what is activated gets automatically activated. It doesn't really depend on the context. It doesn't depend on how you feel. It doesn't depend on what is on your mind. No, a certain stimulus triggers a response. Always in the same way, right? Okay, so sorry, short. So the idea would be like, sorry for the short interruption. The idea would basically be that upon seeing a stimulus, automatically a certain response is activated. Right here you see the pictures of the IIT, you see a black face, and it should automatically bring up this negative association, this negative evaluation. That's a little bit how the IIT is structured, right? So there is no context to these faces, and context, which the idea should not matter. So what happens if you test that, right? So here we see a study by Wittenbrink and others. Here on the left you see Omar, or I think it's Omar Little, right? From my favorite TV show, I think the best TV show in the world, The Wire. And he's a very likable character in the show. At least I really liked him. I think the actor Michael Williams, who unfortunately recently died, was kind of beloved for Omar Little in this show. But here he plays this idea of the kind of the street gangster, which is like the negative stereotype, right? So here you have this kind of like, if you think about black stereotypes in the US, African American stereotypes in the US, one would be gang members, violence, crime, drugs. On the other hand, you can also think about positive stereotypes. So for instance, the love for church music. So what Wittenbrink and colleagues did here was to see, does that matter? If I give you an IT, the same person, and use the same face, but sometimes is embedded in a church choir context. So I would see the picture of the target literally in surrounded by the church choir, or with kind of like on at the street corner with kind of gang violence prime. Then would that impact the IAT scores? And so the idea would be, if it's really automatic, then context shouldn't matter, and the IAT scores should be the same. But what you find is actually stark fluctuations, so that the negative stereotypical content really increases the negative IAT score, so this kind of pronounced bias to prefer white over black, whereas in the context of the choir, this disappears. So it seems like that the same person can perceive a black person in different contexts and have very different attitudes towards them, implicit attitudes. So it's not an automatic evaluation that just gets activated from the face, but no, context really matters, right? Remember when I said a little bit earlier about like, okay, what if the context somehow sustains these kind of stable patterns of IAT scores when we talked about the Banerjee study. Similar ideas, different study. This is about basically looking at how women think about other women in leadership positions. Weirdly, what you often see there is kind of like a negative attitude, that they feel like that women are not really implicitly measured on the IAT, are not really leadership material. But this dramatically changes if you, for instance, let female participants read about strong, famous leaders, female leaders. So if I would, for instance, here Angela Merkel, who used to be for a very long time, I think for a record time, 16 plus more years, the German chancellor, so the German equivalent of the prime minister, if I would read about her and then my IAT scores for women in leadership positions would be measured, you can see a positive increase. My IAT attitude would strongly respond to that. So it seems like the moment I change the context, whether that's outside or even within what is accessible right now in my working memory, really changes the attitudes I have. Similar story, I just want to go quickly through that, but it's a similar story with like, okay, you can see in the US with all the kind of uproar and drama and the many, many difficulties the society still has when it comes to racism. You can also see that over the years, since 2008, since I think Project Implicit, this is where the data from, this is another Banerjee study here from 2019, you can see that the IAT scores are falling, that the overall attitude towards black people is improving, the implicit attitudes. And one idea would be, for instance, that the context was changed, that people are more exposed to positive African Americans in leadership positions, just like Barack Obama here, right? On a sobering note, right, you can see here, it basically, if we have that improvement, it would take the same rate of improvement would mean that in 57 years we would have people on average would have a neutral attitude for white and black people. So that's a little bit sobering to keep in mind, but it's just important to kind of remember there's a little bit progress even for implicit attitudes made, and it seems largely to be driven by the change in context. This is the contrast with other. It's not true for all of them. Maybe you think, oh, people just get better at IITs or they become more, I don't know, politically correct or something like that. No, when it comes, for instance, to IIT scores about disabilities, IIT scores towards obese people, then we don't see that, right? They're not changing, and you can see basically there's if we want to change, right, like neutral would be for disabilities would be more than 150 years of a similar slow progress. But you can also see it's also as likely to double in 150 years and more. So there are other topics where we do not see these declining IIT scores. So it seems that because we lack kind of obese leadership or obese people in leadership roles, so disabled people in leadership roles, disabled positive role models, etc. There's no real change in the context of which we perceive disabled people, and hence we also do not lose these IIT scores. So I think here, this is what Gawronski kind of sums up, and which I want to leave you with, is this idea that context matters. It matters fundamentally to the outcomes with implicit measures, right? In fact, this is what Bertrand writes, in fact, the available evidence suggests that contextual factors determine virtually every finding with implicit measures, including the overall scores, the temporal stability, the prediction of future behavior, and the effectiveness of interventions. We will talk about interventions in the next video, but that is basically what I want you to leave with, and maybe kind of reformulating the starting question. Does everyone has it? And it's more about, does every context have it? Right? And I think, for instance, what is the implication here is if you are at a company and you measure the IIT scores in that company, it might be reflecting more about the culture of the company. It might be, for instance, think about the police. Think about if we would measure the implicit attitudes police officers have towards members of the bank community, then this might reflect more about the culture of the police than about the person themselves. All right, I hope that was interesting and helpful.